Ancient marriage, most people assume, began with two people falling for each other. Makes sense. That's the whole story, with love today. But something about ancient marriage refuses to add up. Picture a young woman standing at the edge of a gathering, smoke drifting past her, elders murmuring just out of earshot. She has never met the man she is about to marry. So what actually decided this, if it wasn't love? That question unravels faster than you'd expect. Historian Stephanie Kuntz, at Evergreen State College, spent decades combing through marriage records from dozens of societies across centuries, and one pattern kept surfacing, over and over. No matter which region or era she examined, affection almost always came after the arrangement. It almost never came before it. That single detail flips the modern assumption on its head. Marriage wasn't a reward for finding the right person. It was a tool, built to solve a problem, long before anyone's feelings entered the room. And the deeper you look, the stranger the whole picture gets. There's a specific number anthropologists keep running into when they check how often couples actually chose each other in traditional societies, and it's lower than almost anyone guesses. Hold that thought, because the reason behind it is the real story here. Think about what a household actually risked when a son or daughter paired off with someone new. Wrong neighbor, and a family could lose access to water or grazing land. Right one. And that same family might survive a lean winter that would otherwise wipe out everyone in it. This wasn't a small decision. It was closer to a bet the entire household made. Als, with no do-overs. Yale anthropologist George Murdoch cataloged cultural data on close to 1,200 societies worldwide for what became known as the Ethnographic Atlas, one of the largest cross-cultural surveys ever assembled. His numbers confirm something blunt. In the overwhelming majority of these societies, marriages were arranged or approved by parents and elders, not chosen freely by the couple. Who? Not the exception. Then, the rule, plain and simple. Here's the part that actually reframes everything. This wasn't cruelty, and it wasn't control for its own sake either. Ask yourself something. If your household's survival depended on cooperation with the family next door, would you really hand that decision to two teenagers following a crush? Probably not. And your ancestors clearly agreed. So does that mean romantic love is a modern invention, actually? No. This is the twist most people get backward. Rutgers anthropologist Helen Fisher scanned the brains of a small group of people, close to 17, who described themselves as intensely in love. Using functional imaging to watch which regions lit up, she found a specific neural circuit lighting up time. Focused attention on one person, a surge of energy, a kind of craving that's hard to switch off. That circuit is old, possibly older than agriculture itself. Your ancestors felt it. They just didn't think it belonged anywhere near the decision of who to marry. Sit with that for a second. The feeling was real. The marriage decision was practical. Those two things ran on separate tracks for most of human history. Almost like your ancestors had already solved a problem, modern relationships still haven't. That intense passion and long-term partnership don't automatically arrive as one package. Picture it from the inside. You're standing at the edge of that same gathering. Two families have been talking for weeks, maybe months. Your mother has already decided this union solves a problem the household has carried since last season. A shortage of hunters, a debt owed to another family, a weaker claim to a fishing spot than the neighbors have. Nobody is thinking about your happiness first. They're thinking about whether this pairing keeps everyone fed through the next hard stretch. You might meet your future partner for the first time at the ceremony itself, in front of everyone watching. That doesn't mean nobody ever loved the person they married. It means love was never the reason the match got made. If affection grew afterward, that was treated as good fortune. A bonus. Never the point. Cross-cultural evidence backs this up hard. Researchers studying societies on nearly every continent, from small-scale foraging groups to early farming communities, keep finding the same underlying logic: arranged unions built around resource sharing, protection, and alliance, with romantic choice treated as secondary at best. This wasn't one strange culture doing things differently. It was closer to the default setting for human societies across thousands of years. A marriage that made sense on paper. Land, connecting to land, one family's surplus meeting another family's shortage, tended to hold up regardless of whether the two people involved felt anything close to a spark. Remember that number from earlier? The one about how rarely couples actually chose each other. Some cross-cultural surveys of traditional societies put real, unrestricted free choice in marriage at well under half. Not because people were cruel, because the stakes were too high to gamble on a feeling. Bride price and dowry systems make the underlying logic almost impossible to miss. A family hands over livestock, tools, or goods to formalize a union, or receives them in exchange. That's not a romantic gesture. That's compensation. For labor and resources one household is giving up and another is gaining. It's the language of a contract, not a love letter. There's a wrinkle in all of this worth flagging now, because it changes how the story lands later. This pattern wasn't identical everywhere. Hold on to that, because the reason turns out to matter more than you'd think. Here's a scene worth sitting with. Somewhere in an early farming settlement, a mother walks her daughter toward a neighboring homestead, a path worn smooth by years of foot traffic between the two families. The daughter has met the young man exactly twice, both times with a parent close enough to hear every word. The mother isn't cruel. She's otherfied of what happens if the coming winter if of worse than the last one. And this match ties her family to a household with a stronger grain store and more hands for the fields. Every conversation leading up to this moment has been about crops, boundaries, debts. Nobody has mentioned feelings. Not because feelings didn't exist. Because feelings weren't considered relevant information for this particular decision. The daughter walks quietly beside her mother, aware that this single agreement decides who she cooks beside, who she raises children with, which household feeds her if her own crops fail. She isn't being punished. She's being placed the way a piece gets placed on a board where every move affects the whole game, not just the square it lands on. Curiosity, dread, quiet relief that the waiting is over. None of it changes the outcome. The decision was never really hers. And she already seems to know that by the time the two households finish speaking and the small gathering breaks apart, nothing about how she feels has entered the conversation even once. That's not an oversight. It's simply not the kind of information anyone at that meeting considered worth discussing. Skeletal and settlement evidence adds another layer. Research on kinship patterns reconstructed from ancient burial sites, the kind of work published in journals like the Journal of Human Evolution, suggests marriage alliances often mapped directly onto access to hunting grounds, water, and farmland. Family groups linked through marriage tended to share resources in ways that look far more like strategic partnership than romance. The bones and the settlements seem to agree with the written records. Where two settlements shared burial customs or overlapping grave goods, researchers often find evidence of repeated intermarriage between them, generation after generation, almost like a standing agreement renewed by each new couple rather than negotiated fresh every single time. There's another piece of this that rarely gets mentioned. Children, in most ancient and traditional societies, weren't a byproduct of marriage. They were close to the entire point of it. More hands meant more labor. More children meant a better chance someone would survive to care for you once your own body gave out. A marriage that produced strong, cooperative offspring was doing its job. Whether or not the two adults ever felt a spark, not romance. A durable institution built to outlast any one person's feelings, including the feelings of the two people who started it. Remember that wrinkle from earlier? The one about this pattern not being identical everywhere. Here it is. Anthropological comparisons suggest that control over who married whom tightened as societies settled down and started farming. Mobile foraging groups, with fewer possessions and less fixed property tying one family to another, appear to have allowed somewhat more personal say in choosing a partner. Once land, livestock, and stored grain entered the picture. Marriage decisions got pulled further out of young hands and into the hands of whoever managed the household's resources. The more a family had to lose, the less that family trusted love to make the call. That's the twist most people miss entirely. It wasn't that ancient humans were simply less romantic across the board. It's that the more valuable the stakes got, the less anyone was willing to gamble them on a feeling, prosperity. In a strange way, was often what took the choice away. The more a family had built, the less it could afford to lose. And love has never been a reliable enough force to protect a harvest, a herd, or a claim to good land. None of this means your ancestors were emotionally shut down, or that ancient life was some cold machine grinding along without feeling. Life back then carried real hardship, high rates of infant mortality, constant exposure to disease and injury, a shorter expected lifespan than the one you know now. Against that backdrop, a marriage that secured food, protection, and cooperation wasn't a lesser version of love. It was survival, wearing a very practical disguise. Passion, when it showed up, existed right alongside that. It just was never asked to carry the whole decision alone. Widow remarriage patterns point at the same thing from another angle. In many traditional societies, a widow was expected, sometimes required, to remarry quickly, often to a brother or close relative of her late husband. That practice sounds strange until you view marriage as an economic unit rather than a romantic one. A widow represented labor, land rights, and children who needed provision. Letting that unit dissolve simply because one partner died would have been, in practical terms, wasteful. The replacement husband wasn't chosen for chemistry. He was chosen to keep the household functioning, to keep the fields worked and the debts honored, exactly as the arrangement had always intended. Ruling families across many ancient civilizations pushed this same logic to its most extreme form. Among elites, a marriage could seal a treaty and avar, or merge two territories into one. The two people involved were sometimes the last to be consulted. If they were consulted at all, that might sound like a special case reserved for kings and chieftains, but it was really just the household calculation from the last farming scene, scaled up to the level of an entire nation. Bigger stakes. Same basic math. Love pushed even further down the list of priorities than it already was for an ordinary family working the fields. So when did that finally change? Kuntz traces a real shift to roughly the 18th century, when the idea of marrying for love started gaining traction in parts of Europe and eventually North America. Recent, on the timescale your ancestors operated on. For nearly all of human history before that point, the love match was the unusual arrangement, not the expected one. That shift didn't happen because people suddenly discovered romance. Romance, remember, was already ancient by then. It happened because the practical pressure that used to make marriage a survival decision started loosening its grip. Once a person could earn enough on their own to survive without a large extended household providing land, tools, or protection, marriage stopped being the make or break decision it used to be. It became a choice about companionship instead of a choice about survival. Kuntz points to wage labor as one of the quieter engines behind that change. A person who could rent a room, buy food, and hold a job no longer needed. A spouse's family simply to stay alive. That single shift, being able to feed yourself without your marriage doing it for you, it did more to open the door for love matches than any grand cultural realization about romance ever managed to do. Cities played a role too. Crowded urban life gave young people more chances to meet potential partners outside their own family's social circle. Chances that simply didn't exist in small, tightly bound rural communities, where everyone's business was everyone else's business. Even then, the shift spread unevenly. Wealthier families, oddly, held on to arranged matches the longest, since they had the most property and status riding on who married whom. Families with less to protect sometimes had more freedom to follow attraction earlier, simply because less was at stake. The idea that love should decide a marriage wasn't a sudden discovery, it was a slow redistribution of freedom, spreading outward as economic dependence on the extended family loosened. Think about how much pressure that takes off a single feeling. Your ancestors didn't need the spark to guarantee food through winter, or protection, or two families cooperating for the next 20 years. That job belonged to the arrangement itself, not to any one person's emotions. Love got to just be love, whenever it showed up, without carrying the entire structure of a household on its shoulders. Modern relationships flipped that completely, almost in the opposite direction. Now the feeling is supposed to do nearly all of the work, spark someone, sustain a household, weather every hard season, and still feel exciting a decade in. Ooh, no wonder it buckles sometimes. Your ancestors spread that load across an entire community. Aunts, elders, neighboring households, all sharing responsibility for whether a union survived a hard year. You're often asked to carry that same weight with one other person and very little backup. Even the way people search for a partner today reflects how much has shifted onto that one feeling. Instead of a family network doing the vetting, checking character, checking reliability, checking whether a match makes sense for the wider group, a single person now scrolls through profiles alone, trying to read compatibility off a few photos and a short bio, often with no one else weighing in at all. It's an enormous amount of judgment being asked of one person, in a system your ancestors would have found almost reckless. They spread that same judgment across parents, aunts, uncles, and elders who had years to observe a potential match before committing a household to it. When a relationship today feels like too much for two people to hold up, that's not necessarily a sign something is broken between them. It might just be a sign the job used to be spread across 15 people, and now it's landing on two. Your ancestors never expected a couple to be self-sufficient in that way. None of this is an argument for going back to arranged unions. And it isn't a case against modern romance either. It's an honest accounting. The version of marriage most people grow up believing in, two people meeting, falling for each other, building a life purely because they chose to, is a genuinely recent arrangement in the long run of human history. Still being tested in real time, still finding its footing. That doesn't make it fragile. It just makes it young, still working out the kinks that thousands of years of arranged, alliance-driven unions never had to solve, because those unions were never asking love to hold the whole structure up alone. It's late in Houston right now. Sound familiar? That question would have made little sense to most of your ancestors, not because they didn't feel love, but because they never expected it to do the job alone. Love didn't create marriage. Marriage created the space, eventually, for love to walk in and stay. The writer James Baldwin once wrote that love takes off the masks that we fear we cannot live without and know we cannot live within. Ancient marriage, it turns out, was never really about two people falling for each other. It was something sturdier, a partnership built for survival that, given enough time, finally made room for love to become the reason people stay.